cultural artifacts. Our earliest manuscript, a psalm book, reputedly written by St. Colum Kille, one of Ireland's three patron saints, or St. Columba, as he's also known. And this evening, we'll have three speakers. Firstly, Barbara McCormack, who is librarian of the Royal Irish Academy and who is the keeper or the curator of the manuscript. And she will talk a little bit about the Academy and the manuscript. Now, the occasion of this talk is that the manuscript has been digitized and will be available to view worldwide in great detail. So our second speaker is my colleague, Anne-Marie. My name is Rudy O'Higgin. I'm professor at the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. And our session this evening is concerned with one of Ireland's most valuable cultural artifacts, the Cach, or the Psalter Book of St. Colum Kille, which is held in the Royal Irish Academy. The occasion of this evening's talk is the fact that the Psalter, the Cach, has now been digitized and will soon be available to be viewed worldwide in great detail. As I said, the book is held in the Royal Irish Academy, the manuscript, and we have here this evening Barbara McCormack, the librarian of the Academy, who will speak a little bit about the Academy and about this treasure. As I've said, the book has been digitized, and I'm very pleased that my colleague, Anne-Marie O'Brien of the Irish Script on Screen Initiative is here. She has digitized the work, and she will talk a little bit about her work and what it involved. And then to tell us a little bit about the manuscript itself, what it contains and its makeup, we have one of our foremost experts on Irish manuscripts, Professor Pádraig Ó Maithfeáin of the School of Irish in University College Cork. Pádraig is an expert not only on what manuscripts contain, many manuscripts contain, but also on their makeup, their materiality, and tells an awful lot about how they were constructed and their history. So without further ado, I will hand over then to Barbara McCormack, who will talk from the Royal Irish Academy.
Thank you. Colleagues and friends, it is a great privilege to be involved in today's keynote session at the American Conference for Irish Studies and to be sharing a virtual podium with such eminent colleagues as Professor Rory O'Higgin, Anne-Marie O'Brien and Professor Pádraig Ó Maithfeáin. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the chair of the ACIS Organising Committee, Professor Malachy O'Neill, and his colleague, Andrew McAnallen, for putting together such an interesting programme of lectures, panel discussions and events in such challenging circumstances. The Library of the Royal Irish Academy is home to a number of important texts relating to Colum Kille, or Columba, and the most significant of these is the Cach, the oldest extant Irish manuscript of the Psalter, and one of the earliest known examples of the insular majuscule script. Allegedly written by Columcille himself in the year 561, the Cathach was the subject of one of the earliest known copyright judgments. To every cow its calf, and to every book its copy, a declaration that was recorded in the 15th century Book of the McSweeneys, which is also held in the Academy. The Cathach has been curated by the Academy Library for nearly 180 years, having been deposited in May 1843 by the O'Donnell family. It was repaired in 1920 when the vellum leaves were separated and mounted in paper frames in the British Museum bindery. Later, in the 1980s, the manuscript was further repaired by Roger Powell and his assistant Dorothy Cumsty, who removed the paper mounting and replaced it with new vellum mounts, specially stained to match the colour of the original leaves. The Cathach was first published in CD-ROM format by the Academy in 2002, with an accompanying booklet, The Cathach of Columcille, an introduction by Michael Herity and Aidan Breen. Today, we are delighted to be able to launch this publication on open access, with thanks to Ruth Hegarty and her colleagues. The provenance, art history, and is an important part of the history and legacy of Columcille. And later this year, thanks to the close collaboration of the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies and the Royal Irish Academy Library, the manuscript will be made freely available online to an international audience as part of the Columcille 1500 celebrations. Today's event is just one in a series of Academy initiatives to celebrate Columcille 1500. In March, the library launched a digital exhibition, The Cathach of Columcille, the story of an ancient Irish manuscript, which explores how the 6th century manuscript survived as a relic from early Christian Ireland into modern times, and how through conservation and digitisation, it is accessible to a modern audience more than 1400 years after its production. In August, the library, in collaboration with the Academy's Cuiste Léinn na Gaeilge, Litríocht na Gaeilge agus na Culture Celtic, is running an online series of lunchtime lectures on the theme of Columba 1500, Texts and Traditions, which will be accompanied by a digital exhibition launching as part of National Heritage Week. I want to finish today just by noting that next month, July 2021, marks 20 years since the library was first formally involved with the Irish Script on Screen project, a collaboration which has culminated in the digitisation of nearly 100 of our medieval and early modern manuscripts, including flagship texts such as the Stone Missal, Laura na Hydra, the Laura Brack, the Annals of the Four Masters, and now the Cathach, making these treasures freely available to an international audience and greatly contributing to the field of Irish studies. We are extremely grateful to Anne-Marie and her colleagues, and we look forward to continuing this fruitful collaboration into the future. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Anne-Marie O'Brien.
Thanks, Barbara, for that lovely introduction. My name again is Anne-Marie O'Brien, and I'm the current director of the Irish Script on Screen project, run by the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. Irish Script on Screen, or ACIS as it's commonly named, is a mass digitisation project of Irish manuscripts. This project began in and around 1999, and we are currently celebrating our 21st year this year. It is a project I've been involved with for the last 19 years, and has formed many different partnerships and collaborations through the academic community, libraries, institutions, and the general public. Irish Script on Screen was one of the first specialist manuscript digitisation projects established in Ireland, and to date it is one of the longest running in Europe. Gaelic manuscripts are to be found throughout the world, in libraries and in private collections. For the most part, like the Cathach, they have found their way to large institutions throughout Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. There's roughly 5,000 survived manuscripts that we currently know of. They range in date from the 11th to the 19th century. If I could have my presentation there, that'd be great. Perfect. The earliest manuscripts are made from vellum, as is the case with the Keynote, but this changes by the middle of the 16th century when paper starts to take over. A vellum manuscript was made from a prepared animal skin, typically calf skin, which had been bleached, stretched, and scraped until smooth. It was then tensioned on a wooden frame and left to dry. It was a very durable material and a precious commodity. The production of vellum required quite a considerable investment. The animal would have to have been killed before its potential for meat or dairy was realized. Only the wealthiest monasteries could therefore afford vellum. This material can pose quite distinct challenges when digitizing. Even the slightest temperature and humidity changes by a person in the room will have effects on a vellum manuscript. The material likes to buckle when it's not happy, and taking out of a controlled environment where it is stored can cause issues. These need to be addressed in the digitalization environment as they happen. As you can see here in this example of one of the folios of the Keynote, the vellum repair, which is made up of quite a thin vellum, has already started to slightly move over time. When it was being assessed for digitalization, humidity in the room was going to be of significant importance. It needed a setup of 2 humidifiers to keep the room in an acceptable level of humidity, so the vellum would stay moist throughout its time on the book cradle. Here you can see the setup used to digitize the manuscripts. We use a non-intrusive capture mechanism called a grazer conservated graded book cradle. Sensitivity to the fragile nature of the manuscripts is paramount to the project. Prior to digitalization, a manuscript is examined and assessed in order to determine what precautions might be necessary during image capture. After the manuscript is assessed, the cradle is used to fully support the manuscript at all times so that no undue stress is placed on the spine, so it's never laid flat. A large format 5:4 Signer camera with phase 1 IQ 180 digital back is used to capture the images. It's a case of old meets new, with the most cutting edge digital back meeting one of the earliest camera styles. You might be familiar with this type of photographic image depicting an old camera setup. Large format cameras were some of the earliest photographic devices. And the reason we use a large format camera on the ACIS project is based on the need to access to a system that allows a mobility of focus. So we can have focusing on the 4 corners of the parchment. To keep heat to a minimum, we use a north light copy system with cold lights so that temperature and humidity are always constantly monitored and maintained. After capture, the image is loaded through Capture One Pro, a raw converter and imaging editing software. The image will then have to meet ever-increasing digital imaging standards, the like set out by the FASI, Metamorphosis, and ISO standards. And these can bring you to a limit where you need to be almost a color scientist, where you have to use targets to meet tone, color, and noise issues. When digitization of the complete manuscript is finished, we then move on to the processing stage. And this is where the metadata is generated for the manuscript and allows us to incorporate it as a new digital asset into our digital repository. This can take just as long as the digitization stage, as each image has to be prepared for online viewing. Adobe Photoshop is used to adjust the brightness and alignments of images if needed, so they match the physical pages in as far as possible. Then a ruler is added to give it scale and is also stamped an identifier at the top and a copyrighted notice on the bottom. After this process, each image will then have to be made web ready, along with any ancillary materials, the like of catalogs. We also now have to generate Dublin Core metadata so that these can be more searchable online. A clean master file is archived onto our database and is also then given to the Holden Library. With the coming of the digital revolution, the way in which people access information changed considerably. In the late 1980s, less than 1% of the world's technologically stored information was in digital format, while it was 94% in 2007 and more than 99% by 2014. By the 1990s, the School of Celtic Studies at ACIS were observing the arrival of digitization and sought a way to connect its published research to high quality digital images of the manuscripts themselves. So it was in 1999, a project called Irish Script on Screen was launched. But digitization was a new concept and was taken with an air of skepticism. The first hurdle was the limits that IT presented. The storage and internet connections needed were so great that when ACIS was first established, it was run as a joint project between the School of Celtic Studies and the School of Computer Applications in DCU. This collaboration continued until in and around 2004, when the IT facilities were becoming more established at the School of Celtic Studies. We were able to host the site in the Dublin Institute ourselves. But when we first started out back in 1999, floppy disks were still around, and we were using Amiga Jazz drives to store and transport data. They stored about 1 gigabyte in a chunky removable cartridge, and you needed a special drive with a CSI adapter at each PC. To give you context, if the Cochiocht had been digitized back in 2000, we would have needed 120 floppy disks or 24 Amiga Jazz drives just to store it. After this, we moved on to DLT tapes. They were the next biggest thing in archival backups, storing 10 gigabytes, each tape costing 80 euros, with the promise of lasting 30 years. A little under 5 years in, and I decided to have a look at that theory, and to my shock, about 20% had started to become unreadable. I was glad that we had made 2 copies. In 2003, with the funding from the Irish Heritage Council, we managed to purchase 2 servers that cost 20,000 for 2 terabytes of data. Each were the size of a fridge. The same hard drive of 2 terabytes is now portable. I can fit it in my bag and costs 65 euros. Technology has dramatically changed in the last 21 years. ACIS had to be able to adapt and change as emerging new developments and technologies were established. Currently, our archive runs to roughly about 21 terabytes. One of the first phases of digitization was run in partnership with the likes of the Royal Irish Academy and the Trinity College Library in Dublin. Up until this point, scholars would have had little at their disposal of remote research material, and would either spend many months going in and out of libraries or be lucky enough to find surrogates, such as facsimiles, photostats, and microfilm copies. These were not considered even half adequate to the original manuscript itself. Here you can see an example of a digitized image we have up on ACIS, the Yellow Book of Lecan from Trinity College. This is the first time it was digitally reproduced. On the left is a sample page, what was up until then the only available copy of facsimile, and as you can see, it's muddied and illegible in sections. On the right is a low resolution image that is now available to all users on the ACIS site, in which you can clearly see all areas. This has opened up a whole new path for research material. Here's just a small sample of how clear the detail is on a high resolution image. This image depicts folio 19 of the Cochiocht, and which I'm delighted to say will have its official e-launch on ACIS, hopefully at an in-house event, together with the Royal Irish Academy, sometimes towards the end of the year. You'll have to watch this space for updates. The main bulk of ACIS users come from the academic and third level sector. The study of Irish paleography and manuscript iconography comprises a culture that students must familiarise themselves with scribal forms, abbreviations, etc., to decipher and transcribe script. ACIS is uniquely set up to allow these introductions with its wide resource of collections that would otherwise be unobtainable to new scholars embarking on their first encounters with Old Irish. ACIS provides a space where the exploration of fundamental aspects of codiology can begin, and this will be greatly enhanced with our planned IIIF updates later this year. ACIS continues to be a very successful project. Its growth has been greatly facilitated by the development of institutional partnership agreements with all the major repositories of Irish manuscripts in Ireland. Includes the likes of the National Library of Ireland, the Royal Irish Academy, Trinity College Dublin, to name a few, but also has developed internationally with the likes of the National Library of Scotland, Chatsworth, the State Library of Victoria, KBR, the Royal Library of Belgium, and the British Library coming on board. Collaborations to date reach some 27 different institutions here and abroad. There are now over 425 manuscripts on ACIS, upwards of 80,000 large resolution images, and all the images are free of charge. Standard images are in open access, and then by filling out a registration form, you can gain full access, again free of charge, of the large specialist high quality images. To conclude, I would just like to say that the development of the Irish Script on Screen project wouldn't have been made possible without the generous collaboration of such institutions like the Royal Irish Academy, making their collections available for digitization. The images, along with the provision of relevant cataloguing information, has resulted in a creation of an electronic resource which has become one of great cultural and educational importance. The project, although running for quite a substantial amount of time, has still a lot of work to do. Resources and funding are always been sought to further increase the digitisation of Gaelic manuscripts. ACIS provides a powerful tool to study Irish paleography and further manuscript studies and open the exploration of Celtic culture to many future generations to come. Thank you for listening, and I now pass you over to Professor Pádraig Ó Mac.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Agus gur maith Ruaidhrí agus a bharbara, agus gur maith gan anol milachlan an éil as cuireadh hortam nocht agus an chain seo Howard. Thank you very much to the organisers for their kind invitation to speak here this evening. So if I could have my slides now, please. The presence of the Cathach on Irish script on screen will be a fitting completion of the long journey that this book has undertaken and the extraordinary history that it has enjoyed, even by the usual standards of Irish manuscripts. Irish manuscripts are unique in many respects, one of which is the fact that so few of them made it to the safe haven of the institutional library until late in life. By which time they had been exposed to the attentions of man, nature, of wars, floods or fires, after which, if they managed to survive that, the not always benign attention of the well-meaning antiquarian and bookbinder awaited them. As you can see, the manuscript is far from being in pristine condition. This is the very first surviving leaf, with about a third of the page missing. And here is a leaf from further into the book, and it is in relatively better shape, though by no means perfect, with writing missing from the upper and lower parts, and the outer upper and lower margins completely missing. At present, the book measures around 19 centimeters in height. Only 58 leaves survive today, containing 76 of what should be 150 psalms. So roughly half of the manuscript is missing. Many leaves from the front and even more from the back. Clearly then, the book has endured much trauma on its journey to the library of the Royal Irish Academy, which happened 1200 years after it was written. So for well over a millennium, this manuscript was out there, as it were. And this is not an experience unique to the Cathach. Very few Irish manuscripts saw the inside of libraries until the modern era. And this is an important point to remember always. Compared to other traditions, we have very few medieval manuscripts, and the survival of what we have is due primarily to good luck more than anything else. The Cathach is our earliest surviving manuscript, and so the story of its survival in many ways is representative of the stories of so many other manuscripts. So what is the Cathach? Well, it's a handwritten Psalter, Book of Psalms, written at some unknown time in the 6th century AD, and it is Ireland's oldest book. It has long been associated with St. Columcille as having been written by him, and because of the book's early date, this cannot be disproved. And there really is no good reason to think that we are not looking at the handwriting of one of Ireland's premier saints, a saint who in his biographies is especially linked with bookcraft, to the extent that one might consider him the patron saint of scribes and of the written word. That a Psalter should be our first surviving book from Ireland is appropriate. It's appropriate not just because it is one of the central books of the church and that it was Christianity that brought the alphabet and writing and bookcraft to Ireland in the 5th century. It is appropriate because it was with the Psalter that the student cleric began his studies at an early age. It was the Psalter that introduced reading and writing to the schoolboy, just as an ABC book would be used in much later times, or perhaps Ladybird books when I was a child. The early Christian era in Ireland was one of the most imaginative and creative periods of Irish literature, and when writing and bookcraft had been well established, the Psalter inspired one of many fine poems concerning books and writing that were composed in the Middle Ages. That's the poem in which the Psalter is imagined as a lover who leaves its first love to sleep with different lovers before returning in old age to its original owner. The poem was discovered by Kuno Maya and anthologized in translation a number of times by Frank O'Connor and by others. It is at once a riddle and an extended metaphor for the love of the Psalter, a riddle and a metaphor that were resolved by the late James Carney. Rafuishle Kethrarir Shin, in the Genach Methlemer, Refederus Biode and Blood, at Glan and Ficked Frifer. At last, after weary wanderings, you have come to me again. Darkness of age has settled on your face, sinless your life draws near its end. You are still dear to me, faultless one, you shall have welcome from me without stint. You will not let us be drowned in torment. We will earnestly practice devotion with you. So the Psalter was not just part of monastic prayer, but part of school activity also. Central to scholastic life within and without the liturgy. And this means that with the Cahach, we're not just getting our first sight of the Irish book, but we are in at the beginning of writing and learning in Ireland. And to emphasize this, we have a little later than the Cahach, or at least from another part of the country, a relic of that very school experience in the form of wax tablets found in Springmount Bog between Ballameen and Ballymoney in County Antrim. And wax tablets, as you know, were widely used across Europe, even into later times, as a reusable writing surface. Once the writing had served its purpose, it could be wiped and was ready for new writing. Ireland's sole example of this still contains writing, the texts of Psalms 30 to 32 in the Vulgate, inscribed in wax by either the schoolmaster or the pupil. Like the Cahach, time has not been kind to these tablets. And even enhancing with Photoshop doesn't improve things greatly. Yet, when we look at both Cahach and tablets together, as we do here with the same text of Psalm 31, in both, we get a true sensation of looking over the shoulders of our ancestors at the beginnings of literacy, learning, and literature in Ireland, and the inception of Irish script. The use of modern technology allows us to contextualize those beginnings in terms of the materiality of this very early book, in order to understand what we are looking at. The Cahach is written on calfskin vellum, and the focus of my own research is trying to get under the ink, as it were, to understand the making of this book and others in Irish tradition. This involves consideration of things like this. Let's see now. Okay, just missing a few slides. Of things like the we'll leave it like that. Things like follicles on the book, and also repairs to the book. I might have those slides later on. The lettering in the Cahach has a simplicity and charm, and possesses interesting features, as in this case of the well-known symmetrical initial M. It marks the beginning of what today is Psalm 57. Miserere mei, Deus miserere mei. Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful unto me. Here the two sides of the M are drawn like two sad eyes, mimetic of the confessional opening of the text. It should be said that this is the only opportunity the scribe has to carry out such a connection between text and script. The other reason that this letter stands out is that it is good to contrast its simplicity with what was to develop later in Irish manuscript decoration, as illustrated by these two examples from later Psalters of the 11th century. The initials in these beautiful colored books, especially the Edinburgh Psalter, despite its modern designation, it is an Irish manuscript, are in keeping with what had established itself by that time, that is by the 11th century, as the template for initial letters in all subsequent vellum books, both religious and secular. So we must imagine the Cahach as sitting on top of a pyramid of the Irish book and all other Irish manuscripts, the books of Kells and Durrow included, gathered in beneath it as in a genealogical tree. As I said, the Cahach marks the beginnings of the Irish or Gaelic alphabet. And these are all in minuscule letters, A and B. The ascender doesn't go above the line, as you can see in B. And in the two forms of the D, we have an oblique sloping ascender, and then a vertical ascender. And again, that doesn't go much higher than the letter height of all other letters. You'll see the letter H there. The punctum had not been introduced at this time to indicate lenition, but of course we're dealing with a Latin manuscript in any case. You see the G beside the H to the left of the H there. This is it's a classic G of the Gaelic alphabet. And if you look right down at the bottom, you'll see the T, which again is recognizable from our old post boxes, I suppose, with the P and T, post and telegraphs. You'll see two forms of S down in the bottom left-hand corner, side by side. The minuscule Gaelic S, but also an uncial S with a very distinctive 3 strokes. Now this is a Latin manuscript, so you can see the letter Q there on the third row, and you'll also see an X beneath it and a Z also. And last, in the bottom right, you'll see the recognizable ampersand, which is not just recognizable from Irish manuscripts, but of course in modern typography also. From which the English ampersand, if you want to call it that, developed. As with any script, once one's eyes get accustomed to it, it is not very difficult to read at all, especially when, as in the case of the Cathach, there are very few abbreviations, apart from Deus, Dominus, and a small handful of other words. Therefore, all the letters that would set writing in the Irish language apart up to 1960 are recognizable here. Here, for example, is a verse from Rowan Varga in Hyde's Love Songs of Connacht, which had such a profound effect on Yeats and Lady Gregory and others. And it contains all the letters except P. If you can look at the R and the S, the G and the T, for example, they're all present in the Cathach as they look there, except for the descenders. The letters are longer here. So the development from the prototype into Cathach is clear. And this carried on into handwriting taught in schools in Ireland from the late 19th century up to the mid 20th century. Here is a story about Columcille that was collected in the County Waterford Gaeltacht, Irish-speaking area, in 1938, at the opposite end of the country to Columcille's native Donegal, which shows how far his fame had carried and how deep was his influence on Irish tradition. The handwriting is cursive and the letters S and R are in majuscule, and the E is an English one, but nevertheless, the continuity of Irish script is evident. This is part of the famous schools collection of the Irish Folklore Commission, containing material collected by school children in the late 1930s all over the country. The story here illustrates a feature common to most Irish saints, that is their impetuousness and sometimes their vindictiveness. Bhín naimh Columcille agus deis go bhfuil éigent leis a siúl cos trá lá, lábhre brothallach saoire bhí ann. Columcille and a disciple are walking by the coast, and they see a boat full of men, and Columcille says that he will drown them all because of one bad man in their midst. His disciple objects, and this disciple later destroys a nest of bees because one of them stings him, and Columcille points out the parallel between this act and the drowning of the boat. Traditions of St. Columcille, scribe of the Cathach, were therefore widespread up to the present day, and not just in his native Donegal. And this reflects both his status and fame as one of the blessed trinity of Irish saints, along with Saints Patrick and Bridget. And the resulting devotion to the saint around the country that is reflected in place names that are widely distributed. Castle Cullum in South Kilkenny, for example, Ilan Columcille in Galway. Here's another piece of folklore about him from the school's collection, this time in English, and from Kilmacrennan in Donegal, where he kills a water monster. Columcille was waiting for a disciple to come and help him kill this troublesome monster inhabiting Meanaroy Loch. His friend didn't come, so Columcille had to kill the monster on his own, as it had to be done before sunrise. The saint was angry that his disciple hadn't arrived in time and resolved to kill him too, but on washing his bloody hands in the river, his anger left him. And as a result, the river Srunafetige, the stream of anger, retained the property of removing a person's rage. That was folklore collected in the 20th century, but it is a direct reflex of almost identical tales that were told about Columcille and collected in a biography of him that was composed by Adamnan, one of his successors, Abbot of Iona, and written in a manuscript by a disciple of Adamnan called Dirbena, who died in 713 AD, over 100 years after the Cathach was written. So all this folk tradition was alive and well shortly after the death of Columcille. And the biography is constructed from episodes that are similar in tone and content to those collected in the 20th century. Columcille pacifies monsters, punishes wrongdoers, and performs a portfolio of miracles that go to establish his saintly credentials. This element of what we might call the personality of Columcille also pervades the traditions associated with the Cathach itself, and these traditions are well known. Medieval tradition records how Columcille, on a visit to a fellow saint, Finane, borrowed a book from him and spent the day and night copying it without permission. Finane sent a servant to inquire for his book, and the servant watched through a hole in the door of the church as Columcille copied the book. The 16th century narrator takes up the story in some of the most delightful Irish in existence. The five Shiach Amora de Columcille and Toglach de Vega of the Chin, agus de Rav Ferg Vore fan Nishin, agus de Laur She Repeta Quira de Viege, agus She Dort Ria, is Ked Lumsum as a Ked Ladia, Tussa de Vuina Hool as an Ogla Hool Tonic de Miachin,Ganistum Hain. The Erigan Horrigadors, Lebreter Columcille, agus Tug Willada Gobtre Fa. All the coldest soul and oglig, gur vanna huilas a keen, gur ogov ergruidamohe. All is not lost for the poor servant, however, and his eye is restored to him when he returns to Finane, who is vexed at the idea of Columcille making a bootleg copy of his book. The matter goes to the arbitration of the High King, Diarmaid Macaruil, who issues what the narrator terms his famous judgment. Columcille tells the king that this is a false judgment, a very serious accusation. And after a few plot shifts, a pitched battle ensues between the supporters of Columcille and those of the High King, in which Columcille's side is victorious due to the intercession of God, who is peeved at having been asked, and who orders Columcille to go into exile as a punishment for asking the Lord to do something he shouldn't have. And that is how Columcille ends up in Ilani, Iona of Mull in Scotland. This tradition confirms Columcille's reputation for scribal work and also as the archetype of the badass saint. It also adds another element to his portfolio, that of Columcille as the paragon of the exiled Irishman, a recurring motif throughout Irish literature and one which dominates the later poetic representation of Columcille, longing for Ireland and regretting his departure and the events that brought it about. An entire series of poems emerged with Columcille at its center, many of which were concerned with the longing of the exile. I suppose most of you know this verse attributed to him as translated by Seamus Heaney in his final collection and much anthologized in many earlier anthologies, most notably by Gerard Murphy in his early Irish lyrics. There are others on the same topic, such as one of the earliest in which Columcille enumerates the things he will miss when in exile. Fuim na goihe freshen leven, arden pette, golgire and lon late, gonette, your mame itte, and the startled cry of the pleasant grey blackbird when she has clapped her wings. And you can easily see how these poems of exile intersected thematically with other poem sequences of medieval Irish on the point of the evocation of nature. Poems attributed to Sivna Gelt, Med Sweeney, for example, and especially the range of poems attributed to Fionn McCool, Oisin, Cuilte, etc. Some of these Columcille exile poems are woven skillfully into the story of Columcille's departure from Ireland by the 16th century narrator I have been referring to in my account of the scribe of the Cathach up to now. That narrator is the chief of the O'Donnell clan in the mid-16th century, Mánas O'Donnell, a larger-than-life character in literary as well as political life at the time. Mánas tells us that the cause of this trouble, the illegal copy that Columcille made of Finane's book, was in fact the manuscript that we're talking about today, the Cathach, so that we have a direct link via tradition between this manuscript and the poetics of exile, as Professor Maura Herbert styles it, as pertains to the exiled Irishman par excellence, Columcille. Not alone that, but it could be said that the Cathach itself embodies as an artifact the story of exile from Ireland as vividly as any piece of literature can. We are told by O'Donnell that at the time he was writing in the 16th century, the Cathach was covered with silver under gold, and to open it is not lawful, and if it is borne 3 times sunwise around the hosts of the O'Donnells, when they go into battle, they will come back safe in triumph. What O'Donnell is referring to here is the use of this manuscript as a protective item, a talisman, that was to give the O'Donnells success in battle. And it's from this aspect that the manuscript gets its name, Cathach Colm Cille, Cathach being an adjective derived from the noun Ca or Cath, meaning battle, and so it might be translated, in this case, the battle book of Colm Cille. O'Donnell also makes reference to the book being covered in gold and silver, and this was the Cúdach, or book shrine, an ornate box that was made to contain our manuscript. It was enshrined, the manuscript was enshrined 400 years after its creation. That is, it was placed in a decorative box as an item of special veneration. This book shrine is highly ornate, particularly on its lid, which we're looking at here. And the lid contains a representation of Colm Cille as a bishop or abbot. So fine is the artwork in the book shrine that one might miss the signature image that identifies the character as Colm Cille. That is the representation of a dove, Latin columba, from which the saint's name derives. The representation of Colm Cille as a bishop or an abbot was reprised by the Donegal artist who produced this famous frontispiece for O'Donnell's Life of the Saint in the 1530s. It's famous for many reasons, not least because of the idea of a frontispiece was new to the vernacular Irish language tradition, and full-page illustrations of any form were unknown in that tradition. The portrait of the saint has added significance because of its manipulation in a political context of attempted rapprochement between O'Donnell and Henry VIII. The whole picture is decorated in non-native Renaissance style in order to align it with manuscripts which the English would be more familiar. But in addition, it contains two Tudor roses at either side of the bishop's mitre, with 2 fleur-de-lis sprouting from them. The one on the saint's right is coloured green. The first use of green in art as an identifier for Ireland that I know of. This elaborately new 16th century Life of Colm Cille is a statement of identity on the part of O'Donnell in the face of the beginnings of enhanced English aggression. It's a statement of the venerable sacred traditions in art and literature which define a cultured race, quite the opposite of their depiction as barbaric animals that would reach its apogee in the Elizabethan era and would facilitate the ethnic cleansing carried out in Ireland at the time. So what we have is the deployment of Colm Cille on point, as it were, in that statement of identity, and also in an expression of a willingness to compromise and accept certain political realities, such as the power of our nearest neighbours. All of this has its origins in the Cathach, and in the Cathach book shrine, O'Donnell's reference to this book shrine describes it as being made of silver under gold. One of the silver sections is on the underside of the box with an inscription running around the perimeter that gives information as to who sponsored it, by whom it was made, and under whose supervision. And here you can see a detail from the beginning of the inscription where a prayer is asked for Coffer O'Donnell. This is the leader of the O'Donnell clan who died in 1106. The inscription goes on to tell us the name of the metal worker, Sitric, son of Macaé, a noted metal worker from the monastery of Kells. And finally, we learn that it was the abbot of Kells, MacRorty, who supervised the work. After the monastery of Iona, the monastery of Kells was the most prominent of St. Colm Cille's monastic foundations, and this prominence is reflected in this inscription. The association of the O'Donnells with the manuscript is also established here, as also is that of the MacRortys, who would be keepers of the Cathach of our manuscript for the following centuries. They're a family associated with Tory Island, but they also held lands on the mainland of both northern and southern extremities of Donegal, near Derry and near Ballyshannon. The enshrinement of the manuscript marked its formal retirement from use and its recognition as an object of veneration, which it probably had been for centuries in any case. And by this time, the book may well have lost many of its leaves. We know that the box was refurbished more than once in subsequent times, that it was captured by opposing tribes on more than one occasion, but we lose sight of it and of its manuscript until the late, after the 16th century, until the late 19th century. We know that in the intervening period, it met the fate of so many other Irish manuscripts, in that it was carried to the continent as part of the general migration into exile of the Irish nobility following the Cromwellian and Williamite wars in the 17th century. In this fact alone, the Cach becomes in itself a symbol of the very exile epitomized by its writer, St. Columcille, over 1,000 years previously. It goes further, however, in that it is one of the very few manuscripts that were taken into exile in this way to have actually survived and to have eventually been returned to Ireland. The manuscript is thought to have been deposited in a Benedictine convent in Ypres in Belgium, and later to have found itself in a monastery in Paris. But in any case, it was returned to Ireland at the beginning of the 19th century. And in 1813, it was brought by the representatives of the O'Donnells to William Beetham, who occupied the position of Deputy Ulster King of Arms, later succeeding to the full office, equivalent of the Chief Herald today. And he was the most prominent antiquarian in Ireland at the time. Despite the strictures of tradition forbidding the opening of the book shrine with the permission of the O'Donnell family and in their presence, Beetham did open the shrine, and he himself records that event in a manner that would grace any Gothic novel. He described what he discovered as follows. The contents were found to be a rude wooden box, very much decayed, enclosing a manuscript on vellum, a copy of the ancient Vulgate translation of the Psalms in Latin of 58 membranes, that's 58 leaves. It appeared to have been originally stitched together, but the sewing had almost entirely disappeared. On one side was a thin piece of board covered with red leather, very like that with which Eastern manuscripts are bound. It was so much injured by damp as to appear almost a solid mass. By steeping it in cold water, I was able to separate the membranes from each other, and by pressing each separately between blotting paper and frequently renewing the operation, at length succeeding in restoring what was not actually decayed to a legible state. In an era preceding conservation science, Beetham's methodology combines the horrors of submersion without any compensatory stretching as part of the drying process to the use of blotting paper, which may not have been so bad. On the evidence of what remains today, one might say that the manuscript did not suffer unduly, but we have no idea of what was lost in this process and what might have been recoverable had the Cach been discovered today and restored in the way that the Fadmore Psalter was. Beetham's publication of a facsimile of lines from the Cach was the first view of any part of the manuscript that was made available to the public. It was probably accomplished by tracing in the first place, as was O'Curry's representation of the manuscript 25 years later. It was another 13 years before her photographic reproduction of 4 pages from the Cach appeared for the first time. This was done as part of the facsimiles of National Manuscripts of Ireland, a project under the direction of John Gilbert, one of the greatest Irish scholars of the 19th century and deserving to be remembered far better than he is today. I've always regarded Gilbert's facsimiles project, which produced 5 volumes, as the precursor of the work that we do today in the digital age. It is valuable to compare Gilbert's images with those of Irish script on screen 150 years later. They show how much the work of conservation in the book in the 20th century has managed to restore some of the text in the upper and lower extremities. On the other hand, an amount of deterioration has occurred in the rubricated titles to some of the individual psalms since the 19th century, so that it is clear that this cannot be laid at the door of Beetham's blotting paper. And it's possible that the loss is to be dated to the 1920s, when the first conservation work on the manuscript took place. The red ink is of a type that sits on the surface of the vellum rather than being absorbed into the skin. And the amazing thing is that it lasted through the centuries, only in this instance, to disappear in modern times. It should be said that this is not true of all pages of the Cach. Columcille is, of course, now let me just see if my slides are here. So the work that I do today briefly is concerned with looking under the ink, and here we have an example of follicles from the calf from which the calfskin from which these particular pages were made. And again, we can see follicles here also, and you can also see an original repair, a 6th century repair carried out on the manuscript to join two torn pieces of vellum using a leather thong. And as our work on the materiality of Irish manuscript continues, we would hope that, you know, it would be possible using details such as this. It's fantastic to be able to feel the follicles and to be able to, as it were, to feel the calf from which those pages were made. But as we go on, we would look forward to carrying out protein analysis and possibly even DNA analysis in the future. And who knows what that will reveal. We use multispectral imaging and X-ray fluorescent technology to examine the texts and the inks in the manuscripts and the skins also. And here we have run a process called principal component analysis on a part of the text to show bring out as much as possible of the red letters in the titles. And here you can see how the ink in the title was also used to decorate, in the rubrication, was also used to decorate with dots the letter that commenced the psalm underneath it. So in the context of Columcille and of our talk about Irish manuscripts, it is no coincidence that the two contemporary manuscripts of his 16th century life by Mánas O'Donnell happen to be among the few Gaelic manuscripts to survive with their bindings intact. The book containing the frontispiece I mentioned earlier has a binding of sealskin on boards with brass fittings. Brass clasps on the forage are now lost, but as befits a manuscript of such importance in its dimensions, this Life of Columcille is the largest Gaelic manuscript surviving today. Contemporary with O'Donnell's book is a manuscript, another manuscript of the Life of Columcille made for the O'Neills, and it's our sole example in Gaelic book history of a manuscript bound in embossed leather. So to conclude, there are a number of other remarkable, if less spectacular, manuscripts that could be mentioned with regard to the Columcille Renaissance in the 16th century. But I must close now, and I will do it so with another famous poem attributed to Columcille and preserved in one of the manuscripts from that Renaissance. Though possibly composed 5 centuries after his death, it encapsulates the association of Columcille with the act of writing and the creation of books, which I've been emphasizing here. As it happens, this is another poem of which the late Seamus Heaney made a version in English. I'll read it in Irish and you can follow Heaney's version. Is skeet ma chrovan screeving, ni diegen ma glees gerol, sketed ma fen gulben coilde, dig neilde de hoof glegel, brinned sroiv negnen nedern, as ma loiv degden desfish, dirte de dig verdillen de hoof in chillen gnischlish. Sheena ma fen mek mrenach tarenach lever legal gan skor frishelva shegen din skis machrov on schreven. Thank you very much.
Gurmil Matafari, thank you very, very much. And thank Barbara and Anne-Marie as well for their contributions. And just to remind you that the Cathach and other manuscripts will be available to be viewed on Irish Script on Screen, and you're kindly invited to look in there. These, after all, are the foundation stones of so much of Irish culture. Now, this first keynote plenary session is over, so it's my duty to hand over to Cianna Ní Riordan, who will chair the second invited panel discussion on library collections in Irish studies, the ineluctable modality of contemporary collecting. So, Futsata Cianna, Gurmahagat.
Gurmila Mahagat, Aurori. Is Misha Cianna Ní Riordan, is Olive Maynol School in Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. Good evening, everybody. My name is Cianna Ní Riordan. I'm Professor of Irish Studies at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. And it is my great pleasure to chair the second invited panel of the evening, Library Collections in Irish Studies, the ineluctable modality of contemporary collecting. Today, we are lucky enough to have librarians and academics from many of the premier institutions across the world. And I'm going to introduce each of them and ask them to introduce themselves. We're going to begin this evening with Cronan O'Divlin of University College Cork. Cronan.
My name is Cronan O'Divlin. I'm head of research collections in University College Cork, where I'm actually joining you from. Although I'm working in Cork, I'm actually a native of Derry, County Derry, and it's a real privilege, I have to say, to be participating in this conference, which is hosted by my university, University of Ulster, where I studied Irish Studies, especially in this anniversary year of Columkill. So thank you to the organisers for inviting me. The University Library in Cork serves the university community, of course, in terms of its research and information needs, but we also see ourselves as a regional repository of cultural heritage within the province of Munster. The university was established in 1845, and I suppose the collections reflect the ebb and flow of events in Ireland from that period to the current time. At the beginning of the 1990s, the university began, I suppose, collecting in earnest with the establishment of the Bull Library. And we started to build collections of landed estates and literary collections relating particularly to Munster. Some of the literary collections include the Library of Frank O'Connor, more recently the archives of, and I say archives of John Montague, and we've acquired a number of over a period of time, and also more contemporary Munster poet archives, such as the archives of Leo Morhillia, Greg Delante, and Michael Davitt. We've also been collecting, I suppose, on the margins of society as well, in that we've significant collections on the women's movement. We have the Attic Press archive, and we've been more recently collecting, I suppose, from political and social groups on the margins of society, with some smaller collections in those areas. Our oldest manuscript is a manuscript fragment from the 12th century, the Regensburg fragment, which derives from a monastery in Germany with direct connections to Munster, and it actually contains a litany of Irish saints' names which derive from this area of Ireland. We also have a collection of other Gaelic manuscripts, and our previous speaker, Padraig, would be very familiar with them, of course. One of the main reasons I came to Cork, perhaps, is because of the manuscript Kinlay Evalin, which is very closely connected with the North, but which resides here in Cork. And it's a 17th century manuscript which documents, it's kind of an aide-memoir of the religious wars of the 17th century. We collect photography. Major acquisitions in the past decade include the John Minahan Photographic Archive and also the Alan McWeeny Archive. Alan is a Irish photographer based in the US currently, and is perhaps best known for his photographs of Irish travelers, but has also photographed the New York subway and Ireland over a number of decades. Our most recent and I suppose high-profile acquisitions include the Great Book of Ireland, a modern vellum manuscript, which was created between 1989 and 1991. And of course, our most recent high-profile donation, the Book of Lismore, a 15th century manuscript from Cork, which was donated by the Chatsworth Trust and the Duke of Devonshire. So I'd like to now welcome Christian to the stage to introduce himself.
Christian Dupont from Boston College. Can I hand over to you?
Perhaps I'll begin speaking while I'm waiting to come on. There we are. Okay, good. Seeing myself back on the screen in a round robin. Thank you. Yes, Christian Dupont, the Burns librarian and associate university librarian for special collections here at Boston College, coming to you from my office. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you in this international conference. And I feel in some sense I'm holding up the American end of things here, being one of the American librarians on this panel. And in that sense, representing our collections. I can say that within ACIS, Many of us as librarians and those who curate music collections and art collections form a group. A lot of discussion happens amongst us and keeps us coordinated. I think that may be one of the themes we talk about when we come to collecting during our time here this afternoon, and how we coordinate our collections. So very briefly, some of you may be familiar with the John J. Burns Library at Boston College. We, among our being a Jesuit Catholic institution founded in Boston, somewhat as a missionary school for those who came from Ireland post-famine, Catholics, the Jesuit and then Irish collections kind of followed from our institutional heritage, and we build on them today. Really post-1800 collections, history, literature, rather comprehensively, but then also artwork, sculpture, and collections around traditional Irish music. So really comprehensive collections in that respect. And with that, I will go back to Cleona, and so she can introduce Barbara.
Can I now call on Barbara McCormack, who's the librarian of the Royal Irish Academy?
Good Cleena. So my name is Barbara McCormack, and as Cleena just said, I'm the librarian of the Royal Irish Academy. I'm very new to the Royal Irish Academy Library. I'm in post about a year now. I just wanted to take the opportunity to explain a little bit about the Royal Irish Academy and the collections that it holds. So the Academy itself was founded in 1785, and its key aims were the investigation and promotion of science, polite literature, and antiquities in Ireland. The first librarian was the Reverend Daniel A. Beaufort, who was appointed in March 1788, so it's a long line of librarians. And the Academy was originally in Navigation House, which was in Grafton Street, but moved to Academy House, which was formerly Northland House in Dawson Street in the 1850s. And one of the reasons why it had to move was because of the extensive collections that were on site. So the collections, I suppose, originated from members' donations and bequests, but also purchases over the years. And in 1822, the first catalogue was produced, which listed 4,500 books, manuscripts, and serials. So again, the Academy moved to Dawson Street in 1851 so that we would have more space to store that material. And Sir John T. Gilbert was elected librarian in 1861, and he compiled a report where he decided that cataloguing of the collection was not as up-to-date as it could be. And so he recommended surveying and cataloguing the collections, and this work began in 1862. And then just to say, there were a number of collections purchased in the 19th century. So for instance, the Edward O'Reilly collection was purchased in 1830, Sir William Betham's manuscripts in 1851, the Hardiman collection, 1856, and the manuscripts of Hodges and Smith, which were purchased in 1844, totaling 227 items. Some other collections of note include the Ordnance Survey collections, which are quite significant and which are widely used in the Academy Library. We also have the Windell collection, the Halliday collection of tracts and pamphlets. And then in terms of our archival holdings, we have the papers of the first president of the Academy and many other papers as well, and 150 Irish-related manuscripts from the Stowe Ashburnham collection following an ORA petition to the British government. So really, the collections from 1926 to 1970, the Irish manuscripts were recatalogued and published. The catalogues were published. And now we're working towards the digitization of our collections. And it was great to have the opportunity earlier just to mention the important work of the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies and the Irish Script on Screen project in particular. And as I mentioned earlier, the Academy Library has been involved in that project for about 20 years now, and it really has been a great way to I suppose, expose our collections to the international audience and encourage engagement and study and interaction with those collections. So I'll hand back now to Cleena, if that's okay. Thank you, Cleena.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Now I'd like to introduce Janet Eden, who's a librarian at the University of Ulster. Janet.
Thank you, Cleena. It's a privilege for me to be here this evening from a relatively young institution, and of course the institution who's hosting the conference. In terms of the collections at Ulster, many of our special collections have been donated to us from benefactors, which cover Irish studies in particular. We're a geographically dispersed institution, so we don't have the benefit of having all of our collections in one specific library, but we do have two substantial at the Magee campus and at the Coleraine campus, and those particular campus libraries would have very strong collections in Irish studies. Now, having said that, we also have benefited from a donation of early printed manuscripts from Henry Davis, whom I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with. And we do have that collection in our Coleraine campus, and there are some 57 incunabula in that collection, and many of those items are still in their original binding. So we do have a very contained within our special collections, and hopefully this evening we'll be able to draw out some information about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janet. Finally, I'd like to turn to Mark Wormold of Cambridge University. Mark.
Hi, it's a real delight to be here, and something of a surprise, I have to say, as a non-librarian. But I'm here, I'm a fellow in English at Pembroke College, Cambridge, which was founded in 1347, is the College of Edmund Spencer, much more recent, Thomas Gray, much more recently, Seamus Dean, late lamented, and for my purposes, Ted Hughes. And I'm a Ted Hughes scholar. And it was as a result of reading Ted Hughes's fishing diaries that I was introduced to the man and met the man who was responsible for the images of pike just behind my head in my room here, Barry Cook. And really having started collecting Ted Hughes material, including fishing rods, you can see behind me manuscripts back in when I met Barry for the first time, we developed that collection as a funding opportunities taken, alumni generosity, donations, including from Carol Hughes, Ted's widow. And one thing led to another. And very surprisingly, in 2019, we were given the opportunity to bid for Barry Cook's literary archive and associated collection of artwork, which we announced the acquisition of in November. And we are currently finishing cataloguing that extraordinary archive. Barry Cook was, as well as a leading artist, and I'm sure you all know that, he was a very, very close friend, I think much closer friend than has hitherto been realised, not just of Ted Hughes, but of Seamus Heaney, John Montague, and we have very significant holdings of their poems and letters amongst this archive, but many, many more leading Irish and international writers too, as well as many Irish artists. We are a small library. We do have collections of Lancelot Andrews, of Thomas Gray. Curiously, this summer, Thomas Gray's commonplace books are being digitized, but this archive, and I can say more about this later if there's an opportunity, presents a number of issues in terms of access to scholars and in terms of digitization. And we've already, Cronin and I have already been talking about possibilities for that. We clearly are working very closely with the estates of these fine poets and artists to work out what's possible. So anyway, that's what I'm here.
Thank you very much, all of you, for your very interesting insights into your individual collections. And I think that collections and collecting is one of the things that emerges as a trait, perhaps of young children when they come to the ages of 8, 9, and 10. They begin collecting stamps, coins, dinky toys. And in a sense, it begins to define their personalities. And I think what was really interesting in the introduction that each of you made, each of you gave an insight into your individual institution. And we got the impression that your institution could be defined by the various collections that are in your holdings. And perhaps I would like to talk to you first of all about the way in which these collections are amassed. Some of you have made reference to donations, others have made reference to purchases. I wonder if we could start perhaps with the Royal Irish Academy and go back to the way in which these collections are nourished and increased. Barbara, could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, so I suppose just going back to what I mentioned earlier, and some of my examples in the 19th century, I mentioned both donations and purchases as well. Today, we very much, we actively try to identify material to fill gaps in our collections, but we do rely on donations and bequests, particularly from our members, and our members have been so generous in terms of donating their collections of books. They're also their collections, let's say, of papers and archives and artworks as well. And one of the things that I suppose we're looking at the moment, and that I would think a lot of libraries are looking at, is the idea of born digital material and how that material could be collected going forward for the future. So this is born digital material. It's material that's been created electronically. So whether it's a Word document or something else that you're working on your PC, you know, it wasn't intended to be printed off. Let's say so it's very hard to kind of to think about the long-term storage of something like that. And I think it's what a lot of libraries are grappling with at the moment.
Thank you, Barbara. Janet, you mentioned the fact that you're a multi-site university and that therefore you have holdings in a variety of campuses. Does that present a particular constraint for your collections?
Yes, it does. I would think that in common with other universities, space is a particular issue at Ulster, and in particular the housing of collections which grow, and obviously which the correct environmental conditions to retain your collections. And what I find that I'm having to do is to duplicate those environmental conditions across its own challenges, both in terms of having the right environmental conditions within the library footprint, and also being able to extend the footprint for those collections. And also the fact that the collections are fractured, I suppose, across challenging for researchers, because they do find then that they're having to travel between our campuses to access material. So naturally, if we could implement a full digitization program, that would be advantageous to getting the information out to the scholars beyond the confines of the library and make the collections much more accessible.
Thank you, Janet. Christian, is accessibility one of the issues that is central to your collections, and how do you work on that?
Thank you. Yes, accessibility is, of course, very important, and for academic special collections libraries like my own and the other collections represented here by and large, or the independent institutions like the Royal Irish Academy, the audiences, we have to define who our primary audiences are. On a university campus, we need to first serve our students, our faculty, but our materials are by definition unique, or unique assemblages of important collections of materials that may be uncommonly held elsewhere. So providing access to the worldwide scholarly community is extremely important, and lowering the barriers against that in any way possible. And COVID's been an interesting challenge in that way, and many of us have been experimenting with virtual modes of providing access. Not that traveling isn't very important, seeing things in person, but also providing virtual access. If I may just to comment a little bit more about that first question you asked about the role of collectors. I love that, because some of us, like myself, were socialized into collecting, either as institutional collectors and now as personal collectors. But it's very important to recognize, I'm thinking of the academics mainly who are on the audience here today, who work with libraries as researchers, that there's this vital ecosystem that happens between who creates and collections, those who collect materials, families or individuals who produce archives, and then that very important role of brokers. We tend to frown on people who make money trading collections, but they're a very, very important part of our ecosystem. And maintaining relationships and enhancing them is an extremely important thing that we as librarians and archivists do, actually.
Thank you very much, Christian. Perhaps I could turn to you, Cronon, and ask you about your collections from my own perspective with my particular interest in Munster poets. I know that you have been acquiring a number of collections in that area. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, I suppose, Cliona, to begin with, I suppose I'm wondering, have I ever grown up in the sense that I've been collecting all my life? And maybe that's a very interesting sort of insight that you've given me into why I'm working as a librarian. But in UCC, we've, I suppose, in the last 20 years, made a really concerted effort to collect in particular areas. And I suppose to ensure that, looking back over a collection, we see gaps, and to ensure that those gaps from a cultural perspective are not there going into the future. So at the core of our collecting strategy, it's not finance, it's relationships, and relationships over the long term. Many of our acquisitions are discussed and negotiated over more than 10 years. And we rely very, very heavily on donations. We're not a university that can afford to go into the marketplace and acquire collections, or at least very rarely. And if we do so, it's generally not with public funds, it's with philanthropic support. And I appreciate 100% what Christian says about the broker, and many brokers are very close friends of mine. But I think in Ireland, we have a very difficult dynamic for the university sector, in that we've been constrained for so long financially, and libraries in particular have been constrained in terms of staffing and other budgetary resources. We're probably at the bottom of the pile in many senses, and that makes it a very difficult and challenging environment to acquire collections. So that's where the relationship bit has become so important to us. And I have to say, the university librarian, who you know, John Fitzgerald, you know, he's central to all the wonderful acquisitions that we have acquired over the last 20 years, and in fact instigated the collecting of landed estates collections. So, you know, it's a real team effort here in UCC.
Thank you, Cronon. Mark, when you spoke about your collections, one had the impression that it was a bit of a boy's own collection that you were referring to in relation to the connections between Ted Hughes, Seamus Heaney, John Montague and Barry Cook. And I remember in particular a very moving event at the Centre Culturel Irlandais in Paris, where there was a retrospective of Barry Cook's work, and John Montague introduced and spoke about the importance of Barry Cook in his life. The idea of the fishing rods as well as the poems is quite fascinating. Could you tell us more about how you came to acquire the fishing rods and how you store them in relation to the manuscripts?
Sure. Well, yes, fishing was at the heart of it and at the start of it. We don't actually, for some years, I was given, and I've now passed them on, a collection of 19 of Ted Hughes's fishing rods, but only on condition that I use them. We do store them, and you can see them on the walls of my study behind, but these are objects which still work and are used. And in fact, my first pike on Ted Hughes's pike rod, just behind me in the corner of the room. That's because Ted Hughes was a founding president of the West Country Rivers Trust, and his environmentalism, and the Rivers Trust was founded in 1995, his environmentalism and his passion for pure, clean, real water, as he called it, and Barry Cook uses the same phrase in one of the letters in the archive, is water that will sustain wild fish. Shared commitment to the environment, to protect the environment, both were activists, has led to the quirkiness of the collection. We have a plaster cast of a pike presented to Ted Hughes in the 1980s, also in my room. Fishing tackle requires different kinds of storage in a complementary way to the manuscripts and artwork, which have now been conserved, stabilized, and are in our college library. It's really the story of my own interest in the relationship between Ted Hughes's poetry and fishing that introduced me to Barry Cook in the first place. It was only, I think, because I mentioned Ted and his son Nick's interest in fishing that Barry agreed to meet me. And it was only when I read to Barry in my last meeting with him, when he developed dementia and lost his short-term memory, when I read to him a fishing verse diary that Ted Hughes had written in 1980, that Barry revealed to me this extraordinary collection of letters, which I know one of Christian's profiles, he talks about part of his role as taming wild content. And much of the material in our archive is wild. I mean, it is the result of a life of collecting, but kind of water stain collecting. A lot of this material is wild, and the letters, including wonderful poems and letters from Seamus Heaney, Robert Lowell, John Montague, many, many other major writers, were in a cardboard box that had once and quite recently held leeks. That's the vegetable. Part of the challenge has been, and we thought we were only going to bid for the archive, but then Barry discovered 150 paintings, drawings, prints that he had made in response to his poet friend's work. And I should also say, including Jean Valentine, his third wife, very significant American poet too. It was, so we have had, as a modest college library, to undertake what has been for us a voyage of discovery in curating, conserving, cataloguing this collection, and in terms of so there we go. I hope that answers.
What I can see emerging in all of as a common thread is that tension between the relationship with the individual collectors and their generosity, and the imperative, the financial imperatives that are connected to the constraints of collecting within academia. Perhaps each of you might like to speak to those constraints. Could we start with you, Cronin, perhaps?
That is a complex question. I suppose the areas that it's most interesting for us at the present time, and I'll be honest, where we are still learning, is in relation to collections that we hold of creative people who are still alive and still creating. When the university acquires a collection, especially if it pays money, we try to acquire the copyright. And that enables the university, obviously in this digital world, to use the collection in a whole range of different ways that are necessary in the modern university. And we also have to balance that with the need for the artist to continue to create and act unhindered from the university. And that very much is based on perhaps some gray areas, but a lot of very strong individual relationships between those artists and the university. And I think, you know, one of the things that the library team here in UCC works very hard on is that relationship management and that trust between the people that give to the university and have relationships with us, and our responsibility in preserving their legacy and ensuring that collections persist beyond the digital, you know, into the next 100 years, as it were. But it is complex and it can be challenging.
Thank you. Was your experience, or is your experience, Christian, similar to that outlined by Cronin?
Yes, very much. And I'm glad that Cronin mentioned also the idea of being total stewards of collections. So discussing with donors, or maybe during a purchase, the idea of acquiring rights, and creating those mutual expectations, because when ownership is taken of a physical collection or digital components, we're in it for forever, really. And we need to not only advocate to acquire collections, but within our institutions or beyond them, our funding base, the long-term storage costs, both their costs for digital storage as well, of course, and digital preservation. Sometimes they're even more than our physical storage costs. So it's very important that those collections that we are taking custody of, that we can provide that long-term view to collections. And that also points out to that we need to be responsible in what we take on, and we don't take on too much, and that we work as really a network of libraries, archives, administrators, so that we can specialize in our areas, we can complement one another collections and make referrals, so that it's because the reputation of an institution really only depends on how well you do something, and you can acquire a bad reputation out there if you're acquiring materials, and then to back your question about accessibility when they're not processed for many years and scholars don't have access to them. So it's a kind of balancing act that we need to do, and it's what I think that happens best in collaboration and conversation. So.
And Janet, would that be your experience as well? I think because of the fact that, as you've mentioned, you're a young institution, you have multiple locations, that issue must be also very delicate to balance.
It is very delicate to balance, and what we're trying to do now is to come at our special collections with a view that the narrative around each of our specific campuses is and develop as part of our heritage in that campus library. And that very point that was made about not overcommitting yourself and making sure that what you do take, you have the skill to preserve. And the issue of relationship management is also something that we are keenly involved in. What can often happen is that donors have managed within your organization or institution, and yet each librarian, I'm quite sure, is constrained by finance, by space, by all of the things that Cronin said, and we're not of curation that sometimes is an expectation of the donor. We, for example, are curators of the Derry and Defoe Diocesan Library. We don't own the collection, but we curate it, and that was managed initially by a project, and we had a project team working on that, but the project team is no longer, and the project now has fallen to me in the library to find the financial resource and indeed the staff resource to take that collection forward and to develop and promote that collection in a way that it should be. So there are so many tensions there between, and it does come down to very close relationship management and understanding and keeping those channels of communication open. So yes, that's something that I'm very acutely aware of.
Thank you, Janet. Perhaps in the amount of time that we have left, I could ask each of you to identify one wish list item, one element that you would like to be funded, and perhaps we could appeal to the members of ACIS and to the people attending the conference to help you acquire this element. So Barbara, what would the Royal Irish Academy like to acquire next?
It's very hard now just to select one thing, but just I suppose off the top of my head, I think conservation is so important, and I think Christian alluded to the fact that when you take collections in, you're taking them in forever. And I know for our collections in the Academy, some of them would require more conservation work so that we can ensure that they will be there for future generations. So I think some of our conservation projects would be something that would be very at the top of my list, I think.
Thank you, Barbara. What about you, Mark? If your library in Pembroke could acquire one thing, what would it be?
I think I'm really interested in support for exhibitions that will tour, and I would love an exhibition maybe in 2025, and I've already been in conversation with Cronin about this, to be able to reach American scholars as well as Irish scholars. and in a way that involves partnerships, or all of the kinds that have just been talked about with the estates, the widows and daughters of the artists represented, but also with the other institutions who hold archives. And I think enabling that and funding that would be terrific. And we're in conversations with Cambridge University Library about that too, but with Cronin and other libraries. So that's really my interest.
Okay. What about you, Christian? If you could fund one thing, what would it be?
Faster ways to process materials so that they can be made more available to scholars more quickly and more of them. And I think that's actually a technology investment. I think we can do a lot since we're digitizing collections to use machine learning, artificial intelligence to help extract metadata to make things more available more quickly on universal platforms. That's my
Thank you. And for you, Cronin?
Well, Clíona, we've just embarked on a fundraising campaign for a new space in UCC, a treasures gallery, a complete transformation of the ground floor, which will open up the ground floor to public access and allow us to exhibit some of our treasures, and also to enable us to build a new storage facility for our collections. We currently use commercial storage. There's a lot of commercial storage associated with the pharmaceutical company, which are pharmaceutical industry, which we use for some of our collections, and we would like to have our own perhaps regional collaborative store in Munster that would facilitate closer management of those collections.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you for this very interesting insight into your collections, your individual libraries, to your needs. And perhaps I could call on all people attending the conference to think of donating, sponsoring, investing in this primary research for all scholars in Irish studies across the world. Íomhá gur míle maith agaibh go léir.